The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is day 6 of this 7-day session here at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. And we hope there'll be a little rain today. It doesn't look like it, but it sounds like it. So I'd like to start off with something that is quite important for everyone to know about in Zen. And I think most of you have heard some of it anyway, and I've spoken of it earlier. But I recently received a book called Zen and Psychotherapy, Partners in Liberation. Partners in Liberation by Joseph Bobrow, who is actually a Zen teacher and a practicing psychologist. And I don't know if it's psychoanalyst or it says psychologist. And here, let me read from the back cover. Zen teacher and psychologist Joseph Bobrow deftly shows how the major themes of trauma, attachment, which means how we connect with our fundamental caregivers and what happens after that, emotional communication and emotional regulation play out in the context of Zen. And of psychotherapeutic practice, and how in concert both provide a comprehensive interactive model of fully functioning human life. And this is something that was ignored in the Asian cultures from which Zen came to America. But let me read a little bit more. Joseph Bobrow was a student of Robert Mitra-roshi and also apparently a student of Yamada Roshi, who was a successor to Yasutani-roshi. And here is what he writes in his introduction. The disconnects among jhana, which of course is meditation, prajna, transcendental wisdom, and sila, which is ethical behavior, a lack of alignment among practice, understanding, and conduct frequently present themselves in Buddhism, as they do in psychotherapy with patients and therapists alike. The centrality of understanding itself, formerly privileged as a transformative element in therapeutic change, has come into question in psychotherapy. I find these 3 dimensions and their interplay an elegant and useful lens in exploring the partnership of Zen and psychotherapy and the interplay of spiritual and emotional growth and integration. In Buddhism, ideally, they intrinsically interpenetrate and co-arise. However, realizing their symbiosis in ourselves and especially in our relationships is challenging. There have been 2 additional sources for my ongoing interest in the interplay of Zen and psychotherapy. One is the ethical misconduct and boundary violations on the part of Zen teachers, other spiritual teachers, and religious leaders from other faiths. It has been a difficult and ongoing education to learn of teachers' respect for their insight, practice, and virtue, acting in ways detrimental and harmful to their students. Tumultuous, conflictual interpersonal and group dynamics, accompanied by organizational upheaval, have also provided grist for the mill and strengthened my conviction about the importance of contributions from Western psychotherapy. And here he gives something that Yamada Roshi said, and speaks to the transformation a change of view of Yamada Koen-roshi. Initially, it was the classical Japanese Zen master's view. Mitra-roshi was once asked how a renowned leader in the Rinzai sect could have committed suicide. And this actually did happen. And in fact, it was, I think, Shibayama Zenkei's Dharma successor one day hung himself during Rohatsu Sesshin, actually, and caused any number of people to be quite confused and distraught by how somebody who could become a renowned Zen teacher could commit suicide. And he replied that the master must not have been fully enlightened. And Joseph Bobrow doesn't agree with that. Here's what he says. The difficulty is not solely in the practitioner. The path itself can stand some examination. At the end of his life, concerned about growing international conflict and longing for world peace, and perhaps aware of discord in his community regarding his eventual succession, Mitra-roshi made what I find to be a remarkable turnaround and integration. Given his own dramatic and profound enlightenment experience, he had always emphatically taught the importance of developing and refining the enlightened I, our insight into essential nature. Compassion and awakened activity, quote, the perfection of character, close quote, would ensue naturally. Well, not necessarily. We have to be willing to do the work. Enlightenment and even pre-enlightenment insights will bring up a clearer view of our behavior. But it's up to us to do something with that. And historically, these occasions have been denied, swept under the rug, in the interest, close quote, of just the koan or just the practice. This is what we were taught through Japanese Zen from Asia. And to be sure, the Asian culture is so different, except that there have been major examples of Japanese Zen teachers, supposedly deeply realized, although there's a question about that in my mind, who have come to the United States and for decades abused their students. And I have heard this firsthand from a number of those students. There have also been American Zen teachers who have done similar things to their students. It's a terrible situation. And it's up to each one of us to deepen our practice in ways that don't sweep these potential behaviors, boundary crossings, or boundary violations, the prominence of greed, anger, and delusion in our behavior, and so on and so forth. We don't sweep them under the rug. This is absolutely vital. I have great concern for Western Zen as a result of there being so many examples of misconduct among Zen teachers. It doesn't matter whether it's Rinzai or Soto, and also other Buddhist teachers in different lineages, in different cultural traditions. Again, it is up to each one of us to recognize that enlightenment and deepening enlightenment and broadening and expanding enlightenment is just part of the practice. What is absolutely vital in our practice is to make what we realize through these insights and enlightenment experiences live in our life, rather than using it to brush them aside, to pretend they don't exist. How many times I have heard it's said that a Zen teacher excuses their sexual abuse of their students in saying, oh, well, there's nobody to be abused and nobody to abuse. It's a very, very superficial understanding of emptiness. So, continuing, given his about Yamada Koun Roshi, given his own dramatic and profound enlightenment experience, he'd always emphatically taught the importance of developing and refining the enlightened eye, our insight into essential nature. Compassion and awakened activity, the perfection of character, would ensue naturally. However, in his later years, he wrote that just as important, perhaps even more important than enlightenment and its refinement, was the cultivation of simple spiritual qualities like kindness, compassion, mutual respect, and understanding. And then Bobrow shares a quote from one of Eiken Roshi's books, Taking the Path of Zen. Bird's Nest Roshi was a teacher who lived in the Tang period and did zazen in a tree. The governor of his province, Bo Chu-yi, heard about Bird's Nest Roshi and went to see him. This Po Chu-yi was no ordinary politician. He was one of China's greatest poets, well known for his expression of Zen Buddhism. Po Chu-yi found Bird's Nest Roshi sitting in a tree doing zazen. He called to him saying, "Oh, Bird's Nest, you look very insecure to me up there." Bird's Nest Roshi looked down at Po Chu-yi and replied, "Oh, Governor, you look very insecure to me down there." All things are under the law of change, and political position is most ephemeral of all. Po Chu-yi knew very well what Bird's Nest Roshi was talking about. So he took a different tack. "Tell me," he said, "what is it that all Buddhas taught?" Bird's Nest Roshi replied by quoting from the Dhammapada, "Always do good, never do evil, keep your mind pure, thus all the Buddhas taught." And those are the part of the precepts, by the way. So Po Chu-yi said, "Always do good, never do evil, keep your mind pure. I knew that when I was 3 years old." "Yes," said Bird's Nest Roshi. "A 3-year-old may know it, but an 80-year-old man cannot put it into practice." It is difficult to put into practice because all of society almost demands that we do otherwise. Now, I'd like to share a little bit more of Chinel. This is from Robert Boswell Jr.'s more recent translation. As I said before, he had initially translated the writings of Chinel when he was a monk, when Boswell was a monk, in the same monastery that Chinel had taught in centuries before. And then much later, after becoming a professor at UCLA, where he is, I believe still currently, this distinguished professor emeritus, he began right from scratch again, translating the whole thing again. And this time, as I also shared with you before, it was much easier to do research because of the internet. When he was first doing the translation back in the 70s, you had to go and track down the sources in written form. You had, I should say, in physical form. You couldn't just go to any internet, because there was no internet back then, and Google it and find out your answers. But much more recently, of course, you can. And it's amazing how much significant Buddhist writing is online and available. So I want to share a little bit here. Where are we? Okay. One of the major things, well, actually the fundamental thing that Chinel taught was as expressed as trace down the radiance to its source. Trace down the radiance to its source. And he had various ways of naming it. And some of these are trace the radiance back to one's own mind. And I'm sharing these with you. Perhaps we can light a fire and be inspired by some of these phrases. Trace the radiance back to one's own mind, or trace the radiance back to one's own nature. In one thought moment, trace the light back and see one's own original nature. Trace back and observe the qualities and functions of your own mind. Boy, isn't that what we are doing in Zazen? With the Susokan, extending the out-breath, staying totally present with the experience of this in our body, and an openness to possibility. We are tracing back to the origin of our own mind. And what is our own mind? As Yongey Mingyu Rinpoche's father, Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, I think it was, said, we are numinous awareness. Numinous awareness is our own mind. This is the out of not one thing arise the 10,000 things. In one thought moment, trace the light back and see one's own original nature. Or trace back and observe the qualities and functions of your own mind. To observe and reflect on your own mind. Reflect on and view your own mind. Mirror your own mind. Or simply trace back the radiance. Trace back the radiance. We don't necessarily think there's radiance somewhere, and yet if it is true, and you can open to that truth and realize it yourself, that we are fundamentally numinous awareness. And you can do that if you trace back through the extended out breath. And this is about being fully, profoundly present with this openness to possibility as we extend the out breath. Extending the out breath, of course, requires a letting go of the things we do to entertain ourselves, to remind ourselves that something called me exists. And that's one of the things that can happen for people as we do the work of extending the out breath. One of the things that can happen is that it's difficult to do it because we really don't want to let go. This yada yada that goes on in our heads can feel like a safety blanket, like a protection, like it keeps us safe. If we are not constantly thoughting, as Mitra-roshi used to call it, are we going to disappear? Are we going to know what to do if something happens? Are we going to be stupid? Are we going to be seen as stupid? There's so much investment in maintaining a self-image. And yet, it's a facade. It's an illusion. It's a story, or a collection of stories, really. So as we extend that out breath and run into a little challenge here and there, a little anxiety, to tune in then to the felt sense of the anxiety, or the sometimes it doesn't even rise as anxiety. Sometimes it can just be a kind of a blah, a deadness. Keep tuning in. Keep tuning in. It will make a difference. It will, if you persist, gradually open. And if you continue persisting, and this is not an instantaneous practice, eventually you will recognize that numinous awareness. Trace back the radiance to its source. Observe your own mind. Remember what Gordy Bruin said that day after sesshin ended, and he had had a Kensho experience in that sesshin at Rochester so many years ago. It was back in the late 70s, I believe. And he said, why didn't somebody just tell me it's about exploring your own mind? Only we don't explore our minds through analysis, through storytelling, or as we find that we have some assumptions about it, we cock an eyebrow and question whether those assumptions are accurate. And again, this is right brain activity. This is not prefrontal cortex activity. This is beyond words, questioning. This is why he says, trace down the radiance. That's why he doesn't say, think about it. If you do it over and over and over again, even if at the beginning it seems like you can't do it, and you persist, you will be amazed at what can unfold and the joy that can be revealed in your own life. If you go far enough, you won't be dealing anymore with the usual conditioning, because as soon as you see it rise, you'll see through it and you'll recognize it for what it is, which is basically an illusion. But it's also important as part of this whole process, as I said in the very beginning, to not ignore times when things come up where you see more clearly your own behavior. And it's not pleasant, but it's essential to see it in order to let it go, in my experience. And once you've done that and can experience the joyful results, then you'll be willing to do it again and again and again and again and again. And gradually, you'll kind of uncover and let go of the more gross aspects. And then there will be more subtle aspects beneath them. And you work in those and let those go. And then there's another even more subtle aspect layer. And heaven knows how much farther down it goes. But it's so exciting to be able to see where we're caught and where that caughtness is causing us to engage in dysfunctional behavior. And instead of rationalizing it or ignoring it or pretending it's not there, to own it allows us to let it go and not to do whatever it is again. It weakens the synaptic connections in our brain that would otherwise be the result of habitual behavior in certain directions. It's vital. Torii Inji, who was a deeply awakened Zen monk in 18th century Japan, a successor of Hakuin, wrote a treatise. And in it, he speaks of what he terms the long maturation and how vital it is to practice. And the long maturation is exactly what has been talked about, and that is bringing to life, activating the behavior within ourselves that represents, that expresses enlightened behavior. And we can't do that until we see where we're caught. We can't do that until we can see where we might be acting in less than compassionate, less than wise, less than functional ways. Our Zen practice is really two-pronged. It's about coming to awakening and continuing that exploration of mind and expanding that awareness. And it's also about bringing that awareness into our everyday behavior as a source of our everyday behavior and a model for practice. And as you deepen your awareness and open in Kensho and succeeding Kensho, then it's clear how to move forward. And I think that's what Mitra-roshi was initially referring to. However, it has to be our choice to do that. And it's all too easy to ignore when we are seeing that we have not behaved as well as we would like to have behaved. And this is not about making mistakes. This is about dysfunctional behavior. Until we can see it, we can't let it go. But there is a necessary choice to let it go as well, and not just to shove it back under the carpet. As more and more people do this practice, and as more and more people use psychotherapy to help with that clearing, it can make an enormous difference in Buddhism, an enormous difference in the world. There are some things, some of us have grown up with such dysfunctional histories, adverse childhood experiences, trauma, any number of things that have caused us to go into a kind of a lockdown, rigid way of behaving and thinking. And psychotherapy can make a huge difference with this, particularly in combination with Zen practice. You've heard me say that all the therapists that I know who also do Zen practice, and I'm not sure I know any that don't, they all report that any client of theirs who is both doing therapy and doing serious Zen practice makes progress so much faster. It's remarkable. So you might want to get hold of a copy of this book. It was kindly sent to us by Bokudo. Then go ahead and research it. As I said, Bobrow is both a Zen teacher and a psychologist. So he comes from the two paths and has integrated them and understands the importance of both. There's also John Wellwood, who started doing Zen practice. I think it was Zen practice, certainly meditation practice, Buddhist practice, around the time he was in college, and he became a clinical psychologist. And he's one of the first people that kind of nailed the behavior, the misbehavior of high-placed Zen folks, Zen teachers, and wrote quite a bit. You can Google it. Google his name. It's Welwood, just one L, and read online what he has said about being able to make an end run around our issues through our practice, using our Zen practice to kind of put up a wall against part of our psyche and shove away recognition that maybe we're behaving in ways we might want to take a look at and change. So I leave you with that because it is so, so vital. There have been ongoing examples of Zen teachers and other spiritual teachers. It's not, certainly not limited to Buddhism. We have clergy and various different spiritual traditions being shown to be less than ethical with their congregations, and it causes enormous damage. Enormous damage. I was arriving back in Albuquerque on an airplane one day years ago, and the person sitting next to me, a man sitting next to me, said, "What do you do for a living?" And I said, "I teach meditation." He said, "I hope you're not one of those." It seems like he lost his wife to an abusive Zen teacher. And the anger he had about it and the negative feeling, negative judgment he had about Zen in general was palpable. It goes far and wide to cause pain and suffering. And our practice is not about causing pain and suffering. It's quite the opposite. It's about relieving pain and suffering. But in order to do that, we have to make sure that we're not part of the problem. So I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.